You have your outline now on the PM side. We are introducing the Song of Solomon. We're getting through a portion of the first chapter here. And as we discussed before, at the conclusion of Ecclesiastes, we had intention of going into the Song of Solomon. And there's a few reasons why, and I think the first is enough of a reason as far as I'm concerned, is that it's the Bible. And in my estimation and in my efforts to preach to you the whole counsel of God, not just preach, but teach, instruct, and help us to grow in our spirituality and understanding, this is a really important concept. Not just that we do it well, that we treat it respectfully, and, to be fair, tactfully, but additionally that there are a lot of really important lessons, especially for the day we live in today. The times that we live in, it is imperative, specifically in the case of love and the intimate relationship between a husband and wife, that we understand the proper use of such aspects, of such important topics, in a time that those kinds of ideas have been misused so very regularly. And the Bible deals with these things, and deals with it respectfully and reverently, and in a way that, while it may at times make us uncomfortable, if we deal with it well, we will all come out on the other end better off because of it. And so we begin our study of the Song of Solomon. Obviously, the Song of Solomon is named after the first verse, at least in the English Bible, most English Bibles, though some of your Bibles, the different translations, will call it a Song of Songs. And that's an interesting concept, especially. The Song of Solomon comes from verse 1. He says, the Song of Songs, which is Solomon's. And so they name it after Solomon in most English Bibles, but when he says the Song of Songs, the idea is that it is the penultimate song. And Solomon would know, considering how many songs he wrote, many psalms he wrote, how many times he spent putting down verse and writing. And he calls this the Song of Songs, that is to say, the best of all of them. And I find that interesting. It's not necessarily what we would consider, and it can often be avoided. People will avoid the Song of Solomon because it brings up sometimes uncomfortable topics and things that are difficult to deal with at times. We're going to do our very best. And as we ended Ecclesiastes, if Ecclesiastes, as we understand, focuses on human intellect, wisdom, and purpose, this book is about human emotion, especially the human emotion of love. But love is a basic human experience. And human experience is what wisdom literature is all about. And that's one of the reasons, along with its poetic nature, why the Song of Solomon lands where it does, at the end of what we call wisdom literature. Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon. In fact, this book celebrates one of God's greatest gifts to humanity: love and sexuality and their place in marriage. It is formatted as many smaller poems carefully arranged into a single work, much like a well-written play, with different scenes and even a few flashbacks. It follows two primary characters: King Solomon, obviously its namesake, and the most eligible bachelor in the kingdom, and who is likely his first and greatest love of his life, this Shulamite woman who is never named. We learn a few things about her, especially where she is from. We learn her skin color. We learn a number of things along the way, and that she is a working-class individual. And she's not the most well-appointed of her family. And yet Solomon falls in love with her, and she falls in love with him. And this is an incredible love story, better even than the best of writers even to today. But I want you to remember, as we study the Song of Solomon, that it is a number of poems put together in somewhat of a play. And so think about Shakespeare. I forgot his name. He is so immaterial compared to this. I'm just kidding. But think about Shakespeare in that way. And yes, it is difficult sometimes to keep track of what's happening. Read Shakespeare. It's complicated sometimes, not just by the language, but ultimately by the way it's written. And this is going to be the same. But it picks up, as you'll notice at the very beginning, if you have headings or subtitles, right after verse 1 it says banquet. And this would have been approximately the day before or a few days before the wedding actually takes place. And then we'll progress on, and we'll see some things transpiring. We're not necessarily going to go chapter by chapter, verse by verse through this, but we will pick up the highlights, and I want us to get the basic understanding of what's happening here, as well as the important aspects that they're going to discuss. So we pick up here, we need to understand that Solomon, if this is placed where most people believe it's placed, this would be his first love. And while over time Solomon would gain a number of wives, 300 in fact, and 500 concubines, and that's unfortunate, we are talking about the beginning of his rule, the beginning of his reign, and before he got entangled with all of these foreign wives who led his heart away. And I imagine very much like a young individual has fallen in love with not the first person they meet, but the first person they find real attraction to, and this is their story. In verse 2 he says, notice if your Bible does this, it tells you who's speaking, the Shulamite. He says, "Let him kiss me with the kisses of his mouth, for your love is better than wine. Because of the fragrance of your good ointment, your name is ointment poured forth. Therefore the virgins love you. Draw me away," she said. So before we even enter into this idea, and we have this call and response, you'll notice the next person to talk is the daughters of Jerusalem, which is another character, which is the idea of all of the eligible women that may very well not terribly be happy about the Shulamite woman taking the love interest of their most eligible bachelor. I mean, imagine all the reality TV shows that are made about this kind of thing, and that's, in a sense, what you have. A lot of people were vying for Solomon's attention. And while they would really want his attention for themselves, and we'll see that in a couple of places, what they really want, it seems, and good for them, is Solomon to be happy. And he loves this Shulamite woman, and it seems the daughters of Jerusalem respect that. And I think that's interesting. But notice there, the first 4 verses are kind of interesting to me because they remind me of when I was a teenager. And they remind me very recently of a young woman named Heather, who we've known a few years now. But at camp, one of the young ladies, she's graduating high school, and she went to senior week and met a young man. His name was Caleb, if I am not mistaken. No.
Chandler.
Huh?
Chandler,
that's right. Caleb was his brother. But anyway, his name was Chandler. And to hear her talk about Chandler, and I gave her a hard time, it made me smile how much she cared about Chandler and how committed she was to him and how much she really just wanted to be with him, around him, and near him. And so it came that he was able to come to our week. And she asked Lowell, who is the director of the week, and also her grandfather, conveniently enough. And she asked him, can Chandler come here and just spend time? He'd be in the cabins, the boys' cabins, right? And he said, I don't have a problem with it, but I want you to ask Chris. And I heard this across the table. And when he said yes, her eyes lit up, and then he said, but you need to ask Chris, and her heart kind of sank a little bit. I don't know if she thinks that I'm a hard-hearted person or what, but she came over and I set down some ground rules. I told her what I expected of their relationship and the limits that that relationship should take, and that while they were there, that they were going to be expected to work, to be a part of the camp, that they're not here to loll around and to distract the people that are there. We've had that before. I was going to put a nix on that. And I said, if that's the case, if you're fine with that, then he can come. I have no problem with that. And she lit up, and I gave her a hard time all week because she would talk about Chandler. And she would talk about his eyes, and she'd talk about how happy he makes her, and I couldn't be happier for her. But to her, oftentimes, I'd make that gagging sound. Right? Because sometimes it's so sweet, it just makes you a little sick. And that's the relationship that these two have right now, and that's what you're going to see as we read through it. You're going to see that kind of relationship, that new love, that budding love that can be so very precious, but also kind of annoying to the people around them. And notice he says in verse 3, because of your fragrance of your good ointments, your name is ointment poured forth. And the first thing I thought of was all those girls that I saw in high school, and they write his name in their notebook, and their notebook was covered in his name, and inside his name on multiple pages, written over and over again. And when they got done writing his name, what did they write? Her name with his last name. I can just imagine this woman who is so enamored, so completely in love with Solomon, that she's writing basically, in a weird way, Mrs. King Solomon, just over, because I don't know her name, Mrs. King Solomon, over and over and over again. That is what we're talking about here. And even to the degree where in verse 4 she says, draw me away. And you know how dramatic we can be sometimes when it comes to love. And that's what she's being here. She just can't stand it anymore. She loves him so much. And then the daughters of Jerusalem come back and says, we will run after you. And the Shulamite responds, the king has brought me into his chambers. And the daughters of Jerusalem respond, we will be glad and rejoice. He says, in you, they say, in you. And I love that this individual, Solomon's about to be taken off the market, and while there may be some jealousy, the daughters of Jerusalem are representative people who appreciate the love that the two of them have for each other, and are going to encourage it. That we're going to encourage this love, and we're going to build this love. They say, we will remember your love more than wine. It's such a special thing to see these two individuals together. And the Shulamite responds, rightly do they love you. Rightly do these daughters of Jerusalem love Solomon. But then in verse 5, notice she has some problems. In verse 5, she says, I am dark, but lovely. O daughters of Jerusalem, like the tents of Kedar, like the curtains of Solomon. Do not look upon me because I am dark, because the sun has tanned me. My mother's sons were angry with me. They made me the keeper of the vineyards. But my own vineyard I have not kept. There was a problem that she saw in herself, and this is one of the lessons we'll get to in a moment. There was a problem she saw in herself, and something that she saw as an imperfection. May very well be what drew Solomon's eye to begin with. It was customary of the time that the people, as it has been for a long time, that royalty didn't expose themselves to the sun. That was for people who were the working class. But that's who this woman was. She was a keeper of the flock. She was put in the vineyard, and she had to take care of these kinds of things. And the sun had its exposure to her, and she couldn't help it. And so she feels it seems bad that she has a tan, that she is not pure white as some would desire. And it's kind of interesting how times have changed, isn't it? That this thing that was considered such an amazing thing in the past, and even in the 1800s, during the days of the railroads and going across into the California gold rush, you had individuals who would even take arsenic. They would take poison in order to whiten their skin, which was effectively killing them. Their skin was white. It was a pallor to them, and because it was killing them was why they had that awful complexion. And yet, to the people of the time, it was considered beautiful. It was considered a prized thing. And notice, it doesn't say that the Shulamite stopped talking, but now her attention has changed. In verse 7 it says, tell me, O you whom I love, where you feed your flock, where you make it rest at noon. For why should I be as one who veils herself by the flocks of your companions? Verse 8 he says, responding, the beloved, if you do not know, O fairest among women, follow in the footsteps of the flock, and feed your little goats beside the shepherd tents. I have compared you, he says, my love, to my filly among Pharaoh's chariots. Now, that might not sound too great to us today, but that was a real compliment at the time. You are like a very strong, beautiful horse that would have pulled the pharaohs of Egypt. Now, you might not like being called a horse, but I imagine she very much did. That sounded like a very nice compliment coming from Solomon. And not just because it's Solomon, but it was likely culturally something. But there's a couple things we need to know. That's the end of what we're going to be dealing with today. It's not time to stand and sing. There's a few more things we need to talk about. There's something really important here in verse 7. Notice, she says to her beloved, verse 7, tell me, O you whom I love, where you feed your flock, where you make it rest at noon. For why should I be as one who veils herself by the flocks of your companions? She wants him to be around her more often, but as you can imagine, the king's job would take him away a lot of time. And there were going to be times where he's in meetings, where he is doing things, perhaps even, well, probably not for war so much, but he's going to have to take estimates of the crops, and he's going to have to do a lot of things, and there's going to be times where he can't be around. And notice what he says back to her in verse 8. if you do not know, he says, O fairest among women, follow in the footsteps of the flock and feed your little goats beside the shepherd tents. He says, if you are not prepared for this kind of life, if you are not able to deal with the fact that I am going to be king, and while you might think that's a great and grand thing, it will come with compromises, and it will make difficult sometimes our relationship, and you won't have easy access to me all the time to be near me and around me. If you can't deal with that, if that's not okay for you, he says, it might be best if you go home. Because this is part of life. As King Solomon is the shepherd of shepherds, he has many things to juggle and will be caught up in meetings regularly. He will not always be available to his love. And Solomon's advice, if you aren't sure you can handle this, it might be better if you went back home to your family. Generally speaking, Jesus talks about this in Matthew chapter 14. We've talked about this fairly regularly. It's a really important concept, especially for those who are coming into Christ, where he talks about counting the cost of discipleship. That it's not okay for us as Christians to jump in with both feet without really thinking about what it's going to require us, because the cost is high. And while it's nothing compared to what we receive, we have to be willing and we have to make sure that we're ready for the commitment that we're going to make. Who starts to build a tower and doesn't first estimate how much he has in order to build or whether he can finish it? And what will people say if they pass by that tower and it's unfinished and it goes unfinished forever? At preaching school, there was actually a place where I think it was a congregation, not of the Lord's people, but it was a church, a secular church. And they built a foundation. And I don't know what happened because it only ever was a foundation. And we saw it in my second year, but I'm told it was there not only the entire time I was in preaching school, but it had been there for 7 or 8 years. And they'd never finished anything, never done more than a foundation. And I don't know what happened, but obviously they weren't committed to finishing it. And it became a great object lesson for this concept. And generally speaking, we need to know before we get involved in something. We need to count the cost and whether we're willing to pay it. And that's a real important question. But specifically in marriage, that's an important thing because marriage is for life. It was intended to be for life from the beginning. Genesis chapter 2 and verse 18. And the Lord God said, "It is not good for man to be alone. I will make him a helper comparable to him." And God sets out to make that helper. And in verse 24, "Therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and they shall become one flesh." And even in Matthew chapter 19, Jesus says, even though Moses gave them a certificate of divorce from the beginning, it was not so. And he quotes this very concept. He goes right back to Genesis chapter 2, to the very beginning of marriage, to establish that it was intended never to be absolved. And there would be some acceptable circumstances, and God would make those acceptable circumstances known. But marriage is really important. And so we make this big deal about the day before, and people get cold feet. Right? That happens. People get scared of the level of commitment that they're making. And if they do, I say good, they should. Because it's a big commitment. You should know what you're getting involved in before you get involved with it. And the reason that the divorce rate is so very high is because no one respects the commitment that they're making. And we joke about, well, they should change the vows to it until I get tired of you. But that's not really what should happen. Instead, what we should do is encourage people to understand the commitment that they're making. And Solomon says, you need to make sure that you understand the commitment that you're making, because this marriage needs to be for life. And unfortunately, Solomon doesn't hold to that. Not in the strictest sense, not really in any conceivable sense, unfortunately. It's led away by many women. But the idea here, to count the cost, and people will get upset if you suggest at all that someone should reconsider or think about it. I never had a problem with somebody telling me that they think I should think about it. And I got married really young. I was 18, my wife was 17, and my family couldn't do anything about it, which really irritated them. But they really wanted me to consider it, and they wanted to talk to me about it. And I said, that's fine, we can talk about it, but you're not just going to keep bringing the same thing up over and over again. I counted the cost. I considered what this is how this is going to move forward. And they didn't want my marriage to end abruptly or at a young age. And I understand that, and I respect that. But what they didn't know was that my commitment was where it needed to be. That I understood, possibly better than some of them, of what marriage was supposed to be because I drew it from the Bible. And that's been something that's kind of frustrated me in my young preaching as well. I've had people tell me that until I've been married for 5 or 10 or 15 years, I'm not allowed to preach on marriage. That's absurd. That's ridiculous. And that would conclude that Jesus was never able to preach on marriage. Is he never allowed to talk about marriage? Because that man was never married. Or can I talk about the bond of marriage in the context of the Bible? Is that allowed? Can I do that? Because I'm not giving you advice on what I think marriage should be like. What I'm doing is I'm giving you what the Bible teaches about marriage. And as long as I'm doing that, then everything should be fine. But we should question our resolve before we get married. And that's an encouragement that I make to every one of you who is not married. And to all of you who are married, consider the vows that you made, but not only to the person that you made them, but before whom you made them. And are you holding to those vows? Are you committed to those vows? And are you upholding those vows? Because we are going to be held accountable for the things that we do and what we say. Even the things that are, in our minds, tertiarily connected to God. Marriage was instituted by God. He takes marriage seriously. We look at verse 7 again, and she concludes here. Notice, it says, "For why should I be as one who veils herself by the flocks of your companions?" Now she's going to run and try to find Solomon, and she says, "Why should I be one who has to cover herself repeatedly in order to go find you? By the flocks of your companions." She is concerned about her modesty. She is concerned about appearing before her husband's friends or even neighbors and the people around her in a way that is inappropriate. And modesty, to be fair, the level of modesty changes culturally. And God's standard of modesty remains the same. But the extremes of our cultural modesty do change and relate to the people around us. And if you're in some countries, I would encourage you to take up that level of modesty, even if it exceeds what we consider modest. And you don't want to look like a harlot or like a person of ill repute before the individuals that you're trying to speak to. And she considers that. And while we might not understand the idea of being veiled before men, to her it's an important thing. To her, being modest before her husband's friends, she wants to respect her marital vows. And that she will veil as I pass your friends because my beauty, she would say effectively, is for my husband, not for anyone else. And that is an important concept in today's world, is it not? That even in marriage, even in our appearances, that we should consider how we are presenting ourselves to others. And it's not just for women, it's for men as well. And the problem I have is that we have this idea that men, and it's true, men are visual. Men can be, at least, and are usually visual individuals, that they are enticed by visual things. And we'll get upset. People will get upset if someone posts an inappropriate picture, a picture that I would consider inappropriate and has no business on the internet of a woman. And then I will see sometimes people who present themselves to be Christians, females in this case, who will post a picture of a man inappropriate and make comments about that inappropriateness and think that it's entirely acceptable. Because it's not a woman, I guess, because she's not scantily clad, it's a gentleman instead. And that's not acceptable. That's not the way that the Bible deals with modesty. In fact, we use a term before marriage, leave room for the Holy Spirit. I think that's hilarious. And while technically it doesn't really work, because how much space does the Holy Spirit take up, the idea is sound, right? To not demonstrate a level of intimacy with an individual that you are not married to. Are you two married? No, then you should leave some separation between you. Leave room for the Holy Spirit. I think that's hilarious and awesome at the same time. But notice in 1 Peter chapter 3. new to the Song of Solomon. It's not only in the Song of Solomon. In fact, in 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 1, it says, "Wives, likewise be submissive to your own husbands, that even if some do not obey the word, they without a word may be won by the conduct of their wives, when they observe your chaste conduct accompanied by fear." When you respect that relationship, it gives your sometimes unbelieving husband a chance to see what Christianity is really about. It gives them a chance to see why you are so committed to such a thing. In verse 3, he says, "Do not let your adornment be merely outward, arranging the hair, wearing gold, or putting on fine apparel. Rather, let it be the hidden person of the heart, with the incorruptible beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which is very precious in the sight of God." We talk regularly about God being spirit, and that works really well for those of us who can't sing. I am really glad that God is a spirit, and while He knows I don't sing very well, He doesn't care, and so I have learned not to care either. And that took a long time. It took a long time for me to get to the point where I could sing without being concerned about how I sounded to the people around me. And sometimes I'm not very good at it still. No. But we need to be, rather, he says, the hidden person of the heart and the incorruptible beauty of the gentle and quiet spirit, which is very precious in the sight of God. And if we pick up verse 7 there, he says, "Husbands likewise dwell with them with understanding, giving honor to the wife as to the weaker vessel, and as being heirs together of the grace of life, that your prayers may not be hindered. Finally, all of you be of one mind, having compassion for one another, love as brothers, be tender-hearted, be courteous, not returning evil for evil or reviling for reviling, but on the contrary blessing, knowing that you were called to this, that you may inherit a blessing." When taken in the right perspective and handled correctly, marriage can be an incredibly valuable asset to any individual. But when we let it, like so many have, go by the wayside and not be worked on as it needs to be, and people don't have the proper perspective about it, it can be a detriment not only to their spirituality, but ultimately to their life. It can be a very hard thing. And so I encourage people to count the cost, but to remember modesty on both sides of the equation. To respect the place that God has given for any kind of sexual behavior, any kind of intimate relationship was designed to be within the bonds of marriage, that the marriage bed is undefiled, Hebrews chapter 13. Respect that relationship. Respect the other person. And your marriage will go much better than it would normally. And then again in verse 5 there, "You have been chosen by Solomon." Imagine that. It's hard for me to imagine that because I've never been a teenage girl, but imagine you're a teenage girl and the most eligible bachelor in the known world at your time, in your country, the most important person at that moment has eyes for you. And how amazing that must feel. But then, what comes immediately following that? Doubt. The next thing you look at is yourself in the mirror and you wonder why in the world that person is interested in you. And you know what? We should ask ourselves that when it comes to God all the time. I ask myself that regularly. What in the world did He see in me? I don't know, but He did, and I'm glad He did. I'm glad that God has given me the opportunity to be saved. I'm glad He did with Paul as well, and Paul asked the same question. What in the world did you see in me, God? Why in the world did you choose me? Why are you giving me the chance because I don't deserve it? And I have to say, Paul, I get that. I totally get that. But in verse 5, she says, "I am dark, but lovely." And that's not her being arrogant in that sense. She's trying to reassure herself, perhaps, that her imperfections are not all that can be seen. And that's not all a person is. She says, "A daughter of Jerusalem, like the tents of Kedar, like the curtains of Solomon. Do not look upon me, because I am dark, because the sun has tanned me." And then she tells you why the sun has tanned her, because she is a hard worker, because she's been put in positions that other people haven't been, and because she has experiences that you will not necessarily understand. I don't mean you, but the people she's talking to. And what you see here is the value of imperfection. Of all the people in all of the world of Israel, the land of Israel, as Solomon would be going around, and the estimate is that Solomon is on one of his journeys to assess his holdings, effectively, to look over the land, to make sure things are taken care of. He'd be traveling by and he sees this woman. And no, she is not delicate and beautiful like you would expect the people of his court to be. She is different, but she is beautiful all the same, and she has, as we'll see, a strength inside of her. And it seems, though, sometimes young love is predicated only on the looks. This doesn't seem to be. And while he will compliment her on her looks from time to time, always a good idea, men. Not a bad thing, women, to compliment your men on their looks occasionally. Men aren't necessarily as vain, but we can be, I'll tell you. There's a value to these imperfections. In 2 Corinthians chapter 12, Paul would conclude that even though there were problems, and he's not too terribly clear on what these problems are, and we can try to conclude from other places what he might be talking about. There's a number of things he could be discussing. Regardless of all of that, God chose an imperfect person. And I know that because Paul is a human, and so he had problems. He had imperfections. And people argue, well, it could have been his eyesight, or it could have been these couple of individuals that are really causing him problems, and that could be. And there's a number of other things that could be the problem he's specifically talking about here, but regardless, Paul is not perfect. And yet God still calls him, and God still uses him. And it's amazing that he does. Now, we might look at like Peter, and we might focus in on Peter's flaws of being impetuous and rushing into things before he really knows what he's doing, and that happens. But we don't necessarily get all of Paul's issues, at least discussed openly. Most of the issues that Paul discusses are his past. And obviously, from how he talks about it, it very well might be something he still struggles with, dealing with. In verse 7 he says, "Unless I should be exalted above measure by the abundance of the revelations." So he says, I accept that I could be arrogant at times, Paul says. And perhaps God gave me these thorns in the flesh, or at least refused to remove them because he didn't want me to be arrogant. And some of you might see recently, we paid the final payment on what Tricia calls my life. That's what she writes in the checkbook when she writes the check to the loan agency that has our loan from the hospital bills. And it has been a long time getting through that. And the feelings that have come through finishing that has been pretty excellent. But it's also something that reminds us of how frail life is. And I wonder if God hasn't allowed me to go through things like this, because it seems like every time we have money and we're doing really well, something happens. And I wonder if God doesn't know that I'm going to be a terrible arbiter of that money, and so he just keeps me from it. And at times I say, I get kind of upset about it. Like, it'd be okay if there was a little bit more of that.